This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I want to give a special thank you to Barbara Eastman, who just increased her pledge amount. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. Alright, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 548 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories. Publishers Weekly says, visceral settings and robust characters will have readers marveling at how much Kirtley is able to fit into a limited page count. For SFF fans with no time to sink into a doorstopper, these concentrated doses of genre goodness will hit the spot. And Kirkus Reviews writes, Kirtley employs sharp, concise prose that complements his puckish sense of humor. The author's passionate voice breathes life into this wonderful array of tales. So again, the book is called Save Me Please and Other Stories, and it's available now on Amazon.com. And our guest today is Susan Palwick, author of the novels Flying in Place, The Necessary Beggar, Shelter, and Mending the Moon. The Necessary Beggar was recently reissued by Tor as part of their Tor Essentials line of science fiction classics. Her short fiction appears in magazines such as Asimov's, the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and Tor.com, and she was one of the founders of the New York Review of Science Fiction. And in this interview, we'll be discussing her short story collections The Fate of Mice and All Worlds Are Real. And now here's our interview with Susan Palwick. All right, so we're here with Susan Palwick. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I want to start off with your first short story collection, The Fate of Mice. So how'd that book come about?
That book came about because my story, Gastella, which is, you know, like if there are still people reading stories in 100 years, if anybody remembers anything of mine, that's the thing they'll remember, right? And I think I was at some convention. I can't remember if it was a Worldcon or World Fantasy, which are the only two I ever attend, but somebody from Tachyon, I think Bernie Goodman had said, oh, you should have a story collection. And then I talked to Jacob Weissman, and Jacob was like, yeah, let's do a story collection. So that's how that came about. But I think it was because Bernie was so enthusiastic about Gastella.
Yeah. I mean, the first time I heard your name was when I read Gastella in the Starlight 3 anthology, and I was just blown away by it. I mean, I have described the story many times over the years to people and have often said it's my favorite werewolf story that I've ever read.
Thank you. Carrie Vaughan once told me that, which was, talk about being blown away. We were doing a joint signing at a Worldcon, and I was next to her, and she had a line, 5 blocks long, and I had like 3 people. And at one point, in one of her few pauses, I was sitting there knitting. She turned to me and said, I just want to tell you that I love Gastella, and I tell people that it's absolutely foundational to the field. And I was, floating on air for the rest of the day.
Yeah, and I'm sure she's read more werewolf stories than I have, so that means something.
Probably more than anybody, yeah.
So that's cool. So then what was the process like of putting the collection together and having it come out and everything?
I went back through the stories I'd published and picked out a bunch and showed them to Jacob and his team. There was one that one of his folks didn't like, which wound up in All Worlds Are Real. That was Cucumber Gravy. And otherwise, I think he picked the order of them. Honestly, it was a while back now, and I don't remember very well how that all worked. But I was very, very happy with the final product. I love the cover. I love both of my covers for the collections, and it got some nice notice, and that felt really good. So.
Yeah. So I'll explain. The book came out in 2007, The Fate of Mice, and it
Yes.
collects stories going back to your first published. You first started publishing short fiction in 1985, so there's sort of a 20-year span of that you had to draw on.
Right. And that first story is not in the collection, but most and some of actually a lot of my earliest work isn't. I think. What is the earliest? The earliest story in here is either Elephant or Ever After. I'll have to check the page to see. Okay, Elephant was 86. Ever After was 87. Yeah, so those are the two earliest.
Yeah, Ever After was also one of my favorite stories in this book. I thought it was a tremendous story.
Thank you. Yeah, I really like that. And, and Gastella and Ever After both came out of sort of, traumatic moments in my life. So, they're classic examples of, you take an unpleasant thing and you turn it into art. So, that's always a fun process. Terry Windling, who is one of my favorite writers and editors, said once, she's had a tough life, and she said once, whenever anything bad happens to me, I say, I'm a writer, I can use this. That's become one of my mottos.
Yeah, well, definitely. And I saw in an interview you said, I've written stories that began and continued explicitly as responses to gender issues or tropes. Ever After and Gastella are the two best known in that category.
Right. Exactly. And one of the sparking moments for Gastella was I had just turned 39, and I was in an internet chat with a bunch of people and mentioned this, and some guy was like, oh, well, your husband will never find you attractive again, even if he lies and says he does. And I'm like, what what in the world? Like, and then the other part of that was we had just lost a cat, which was the inspiration for going after Bobo. And I went to the pound every day to look for him. And on one of those trips, there was a guy surrendering a dog, young, healthy dog. And he's like, well, I wanted a hunting dog. This isn't a hunting dog. And the shelter staff said, you understand that the dog will probably have to be put down because it's hard to adopt out, grown animals. And he said, well, I don't want this dog. And meanwhile, his little boy, who was 6, 7, 8, somewhere in there, was sitting on the ground with his arms around the dog, looking up at passersby and saying, he's a good dog. And it's just like, and then, they're leaving and the guy says to his son, oh, we have to go buy a birthday present for mommy. And I'm thinking, what was his to-do list this morning? Kill dog, buy birthday gift for wife, traumatized son. It was just one of those moments. So those two things turned into Gastella. Yeah.
I guess maybe I'll explain for listeners. So the premise of the story is that there's a young woman from, I gather, sort of Eastern Europe. I don't think it's specified in the story. And she is a werewolf. So she sort of, turns from a human into not a sort of wolf man kind of, but into an actual kind of wolf. And she meets this American professor and they get married. And she ages in dog years. So she ages 7 times faster than a normal person. And so when they first meet, she's, very young and beautiful. And then he becomes, increasingly dissatisfied as she ages much more quickly than he does.
Right. Yeah. As far as I can tell, that gender dynamic is still at play. I mean, this story is a while ago now. I was 39 when I wrote it. I'm 62 now. And if you've seen the Barbie movie, which we saw last weekend and loved, you know that this kind of thing is still happening. I mean, we fetishize youth in women in this country, and women still often get discarded when they're older.
So what was it like emotionally writing that story? Did it just sort of like pour out of you in a hot rage?
Yeah. That's exactly what happened. It poured out of me in rage, and in a couple of sittings. and Ever After kind of did too. I mean, that took a little longer to write, but that was also sparked by anger at a breakup. Actually, I mean, I had been somebody I cared about a lot and thought I was going to marry, broke up with me over the phone 3 weeks before Christmas. And a few weeks after that, the phone rang, and I thought it was this person because I was half asleep, right? And we had a pretty long conversation, and then I realized it wasn't the person, and it was, like a creep playing along with me, pretending to be, and I hung up really quickly. But it was a lesson in how we can fool ourselves when we want something to be true.
So wait, so some stranger called you?
Yeah.
And just randomly?
It was a porno call, basically, right? But
Okay.
But he didn't start out that way. I mean, it started out a lot more civilized. And I thought it was, and I said, "Oh, so-and-so." And he's like, "Yeah, how are you doing?" I mean, he was following my lead. I mean, I had made the mistake of saying the name. And it got sort of, increasingly weird over 5 or 10 minutes. And finally I'm like, "Oh, you're not so-and-so," and hung up. And a week later, the phone rang, and it was the same creep saying, "Hi, I'm so-and-so." I'm like, "No, you're not." And hung up again.
So how did that inspire how did you get from that experience to Ever After?
And it was also the experience of the breakup, which was this kind of, I thought it was my fairy tale, and then it turned out to be something very different. And so it was, "Oh, you think X is happening, and really Y is happening. Something much less pleasant is happening." If that makes sense.
Yeah, I apologize to listeners. I'm going to spoil Ever After. There's just no way to talk about it. So if you're adamantly opposed to spoilers, stop listening now.
Block your ears. Block your ears.
But so Ever After, the premise basically, it's like the fairy godmother from Cinderella is a vampire who recruits woman after woman to be kind of the next Cinderella, and she turns them into vampires over the course of sort of grooming them to meet the prince and go to the ball and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Is that an accurate synopsis of the story?
Yeah. And there comes the moment when she has to reveal to the Cinderella character, or the Cinderella character realizes what's been happening. I mean, and the fairy godmother is presented as, a compassionate character in a way, right? Like, she's not completely a villain. I don't like straight up villains. I find them pretty boring for the most part. When I taught writing, which I did for many years, I used to tell my students, I would still tell my students this: look, very few people wake up in the morning intending to be evil. So your villains need relatable motivations. I mean, your villains need to have reasons why they think they're doing the right thing and being the good folks. And that will make them much more complicated and much more interesting, if we can understand their point of view. I don't like fiction that allows us to take sides really easily.
So the fairy godmother in the story, what do you think is her, like, what is the sympathetic read on what she's doing?
The sympathetic read is, from her point of view, she's empowering this young woman, right? You're going to, let me flip to the story. Hang on here. Why can't I find it? Hello? Oh, hang on. Okay, I've got to go to the table of contents. I don't remember where it is. Oh, it's later in the book. That's why. And the story's written from the godmother's point of view, right? And and she says, "You'll never be ugly. You'll always be as beautiful as you are now, as beautiful as I am." And then she says, "We shelter our young as the mortal mothers shelter theirs. Those human women who of necessity are as predatory as we and as dependent on the invitation to feed." So, it's a tragic story, but she's also she's granting immortality, which is one of the classic vampire tropes.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the story, in a couple of places, it draws connections between vampirism and humanity. I mean, so at one point, the fairy godmother says, "Living women feed off their men as we do, and they require permission to enter houses and go to dances as we do, and they depend on spells of seeming."
Right.
And
right.
Oh, you want go ahead?
Well, just that and that was one of the big sparks for that story. I mean, when I realized that Cinderella and the vampire story line up very, very neatly because of those three factors, right?
Yeah, and then one of the things I loved about the story is there's this priest character. Sort of at one point, this priest gets called in to perform an exorcism or something, and he's almost. It turns out he's like a vampire super fan almost, and is actually going to help the Cinderella character.
Right.
But he says this is the other vampire parallel I wanted to mention. He says the church cannot get sons the normal way, so it takes other people's and leaves the best young men to breed more souls. You and I are not, you see, so very different. I guess, sorry, he's speaking to the godmother character in that part.
Right.
The vampire.
Right. Exactly. And then there's the whole bit with blood as communion wine. There's there's that parallel too. So yeah, and he is a sympathetic character, and he because someone he loves has been turned, and he wouldn't want that person to be hurt, so he doesn't want to hurt the characters in the story.
I don't know if you've read Neil Gaiman's story Snow Glass Apples, which is also, it's sort of Snow White as a vampire.
I haven't.
I was wondering if your story had maybe, because the it's a Neil Gaiman story. He wrote it maybe 10 years after this came out. So I was wondering if you saw that and was like, oh, fairy tale vampires. Like fairy tales plus vampires is a very fruitful sort of combination.
It's a thing. I mean, I suspect other people have done it too. There's a lot there that lends itself. So, yeah.
Yeah. And so what sort of response did you get to Gastella and to Ever After? Like, did you get reviews, or you said Gastella made a really big splash, I guess you said, right?
Yeah, it did. I mean, it got picked up for a bunch of years best. Also, it was top ranking for the Sturgeon Award. And people are either, this story ripped my heart out and I love you, or this story ripped my heart out and I hate you. Yeah. I mean, I had somebody on Twitter say, how dare you do this to me? I hate you. You're a horrible, horrible person, blah, 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 blah. And I responded. I think we wound up having a conversation on Facebook, and that reader kind of calmed down a little and said, because another thing I always told my writing students was, okay, look, if you have a really strong reaction to a story, that means it was a good story, even if you didn't enjoy the reaction, because it was well written enough to elicit feeling, right? So I wound up having that conversation with this particular reader, who kind of grudgingly admitted that, okay, I wasn't a bad writer. She had just had a really strong reaction to the story.
Yeah, this past week I read the story to my wife, and I had read it 20 years ago, so I knew
Uh-huh.
the plot, but I could not make it to
Uh-huh.
the end of the story without just completely losing it. I had a really hard
Uh-huh.
time just finishing without getting, because I was so choked up
Yeah.
reading it. It's
Yeah.
just like that
Yeah.
that powerful of a story.
Thank you. Um, yeah, and I still, it still affects me the same way, and I think affects a lot of other people the same way. And as I said, if anybody's reading anything of mine after I die, it'll be that probably.
Uh-huh.
So,
Um, so in one of these interviews, I read a bunch of interviews with you, and in one of them you
mhm,
say about your early career, you say, if I hadn't met Ellen Kushner, who introduced me to David Hartwell, who introduced
right.
me to Ellen Datlow and the Nielsen Haydens, and too many other people to name, I wouldn't have a career. So could you sort of walk us through that? What was that like, meeting all these
So
people?
it was amazing. I had been an English and creative writing major at Princeton, where the creative writing workshops, everybody was producing sort of, contemporary literary fiction, right? And I was not. And my instructors, were very kind but baffled and kind of scratching their heads, and finally said, okay, look, find some other place to get feedback on this stuff and write normal stories for us,
Hmm.
right? And so I was a member of the Princeton Science Fiction Society, and so we started up an on-campus writing workshop and invited, because we were so close to New York, well, we were between New York and Philadelphia, and there are a lot of professionals in both places, so we invited people to come talk to us, to come be, guest speakers. And Ellen Kushner was one of them. I think that was after I graduated, actually, but I, was going back down for the workshops, and she and I hit it off. And she said, "Oh, you should meet my friend David Hartwell." And I met David Hartwell, who said, "Oh, because I'd studied poetry a lot," and he said, "Oh, you should." Um, and I think I published poetry and amazing at that point too, but he said, oh, you should join the Little magazine, which was the poetry magazine that he was running at that point. And then, which, the meetings for which met in Chip Delaney's living room. So Ellen was also indirectly responsible for my meeting Chip. And then in 80, that was 85, because it was right before I went to Clarion West in Seattle, which was in 1985. And then in 1988, the Little magazine morphed into the New York Review of Science Fiction, which was David and Chip and the Nielsen Haydens and Tom Weber, who became Soren de Selby, and me, and over the years, various other people, Gordon Van Gelder, and too many others to name. So
Yeah. Yeah. I used to volunteer at the New York Review of Science Fiction, so I spent a lot of time at David Hartwell's house,
oh, wow.
proofreading and
Yeah.
stuff like
Oh,
that.
and Catherine. Yeah, Catherine. Catherine. How could I forget Catherine? Sure. So, Catherine Kramer. When were you doing that?
It would have been around 2004 that I was doing that.
Okay. Okay. So, well after I had moved to Reno and was no longer an active member of NEARSIF.
Yeah, but it was just sort of interesting for me to see that you were involved in founding it. So I was like, oh, that's
Mm-hmm.
cool.
Yeah.
I never. What was that like? The those initial conversations, or what was the initial couple meetings like, or whatever?
For NEARSIF?
Yeah.
Well, David felt very strongly that that the field needed better reviewing, and that instead of people saying, oh, I hated this book, people needed to say, this is an interesting and worthy book, and say why, right? That there needed to be more sort of strengths-based reviewing out there. So that was what we set out to do. And I think we did a good job. It was fun.
Yeah. And so then you became an English professor.
I did.
So what was that like?
Um, I, so I spent 20 years as an English professor, and it started out great. It was an ideal job. I had a 2-2 teaching load, which never happens in the academy anymore. That's 2 courses a semester. It's usually 4, sometimes it's 5. They tenured me for writing science fiction and fantasy, which, when I was tenured in 2003 was still pretty unusual. It's more usual now, at least a little more usual. And I was in a really nice department. I mean, I was not in a department where people were stabbing each other in the back for the most part. But I had some wonderful students, terrific students. But as the years went by, I became disenchanted with it. I burned out on teaching largely, because, and students would come to me sometimes and say, I want to be you when I grow up. I want to be an English professor. I want to teach writing. And I'd always sit them down and say, okay, English professors are people who love language and love good writing. And if you are teaching writing, you are going to be plowing through an immense amount of really bad writing. And you're going to be helping the writers make it better, but it may still not be good. And just think about whether you want to do that. Because in a stack of 20 manuscripts, there would be 1 or 2 that were great and a bunch that were okay. And then some that were just, really, really challenging and challenged. And it got to the point where if I was looking at a stack of student manuscripts, I could feel a force field like pushing me away from the papers. And at that point I was like, okay, I've got to do something else. So I switched careers.
And so you switched to being you'd been volunteering at a hospital for a long time.
So, yeah. Okay. So this is a bit of a long story. I had been in 98, I went through a very unexpected religious conversion and wound up being an Episcopalian, which shows up in some of my stories. And as part of that, I wound up volunteering in a local emergency room as a lay chaplain, basically. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It was my favorite 4 hours of the week. Part of the teaching burnout was that I realized that the stories I was hearing from my patients, for the most part, I found more compelling than the stories I was reading for my students, right? So I did that for 10 plus years. And when I was looking at changing careers, because to be fair to myself and my students in the department, I'm like, I need to get out of here. Like, I'm not doing anybody any good right now. I thought, well, I want to go into healthcare, but nobody's going to hire me as a chaplain because I don't have certain credentials. So but social work, there's a school of social work at UNR. So I retired from the English department in 2017, got my MSW. And then the first job that popped up was an entry-level chaplain job at a local hospital at our trauma center, actually, not the one where I'd been volunteering. I applied for that, got that, was there for almost 2 years through the height of COVID. Okay. So that was pretty intense. And then after COVID, they laid off 166 people, including 3 of the 4 chaplains. So I and 2 other people found ourselves on the street. I was then a hospice chaplain for 1.5 years. And then I wasn't, that work didn't appeal to me as much. So I swiveled back to social work, and I'm now working as a social worker in a dialysis clinic.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite a journey.
It's quite a journey, yeah.
And so in the second collection, it's called All Worlds Are Real. There's a story called Remote Presence, which about a hospital chaplain and a ghost in a hospital that he meets in a hospital. And I would imagine is that pretty much autobiographical, or are there some major diversions?
No. I wrote it. I wrote it before I had become a professional chaplain. I wrote it when I was still a volunteer. So there's some stuff I got wrong. If I were writing it now, I would fix that. But it's autobiographical to the extent that those rooms and smells and, and situations were all things I had encountered. I mean, not the ghost, but, patients with certain conditions, the people in the waiting room throwing up into barf bags, the people show up with gangrene. So everybody on, all the staff have the Vicks Vapor Rub under their noses because it's, if you've ever smelled gangrene, it's unmistakable and pretty unpleasant. And also the tension between doing the best for patients and meeting regulatory requirements, right? Healthcare is the most heavily regulated industry in the country. So those, and the hospital in the story is undergoing a joint commission inspection, and those get people, very, very on edge. So, all of that was material I drew from.
Yeah, I mean, that was one thing I really liked about the stories in these collections is how much you draw clearly on a deep knowledge of, people in difficult situations and
Thank you.
Just the ways that people can be struggling, which you write about with so much empathy. And so in addition to the hospital work that you did, you also, I came across this interview that was on Tangent Online from 2013, where you talk a lot about your sort of upbringing and some of the family dysfunction that you experienced growing up.
Yeah. Putting the fun in dysfunction. Yep.
Yeah. So, without dwelling on it too much, I mean, there's alcoholism and mental illness and stuff like that, that I could definitely see, having read, stories like Recoveries.
Right.
I could definitely see how that had influenced that story.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing there was, so my mom was alcoholic, but got into recovery when I was like 3.5. And when I was about 8, she told me about this because she went off to an AA meeting every Thursday night. And for a long time, she didn't tell me what that was, although I had figured it out because she talked to her friends on the phone, right? And when I was about 8, she said, would you like to come to a meeting with me to see what it's like? And I'm like, sure. And I went, and I just loved it. I absolutely loved it. They were open meetings, and it was all of these people telling these stories. And some of them were funny and some of them were sad, but they were all true and they all had happy endings. Okay. I mean, they were all about people overcoming really difficult things to get to the point where they could stand in front of a group of other people and say, hi, my name is so-and-so and I'm an alcoholic and I've been sober X amount of time. Right. And to me, that was pretty wonderful. And so I was just enthralled by this, and remain a big fan of 12-step groups. I mean, some of which helped me when my father and stepmother were also alcoholic. They're all dead now, so, there's no shame in saying any of this. And so Alateen helped me a lot, when I was in high school, and after college for a while, I went to Al-Anon, and, so I have an abiding fondness for those groups. But at some point, I realized that alien abductees and AA had the same initials, and I'm like, ooh, what can we do with that? So that's where that story came from.
Yeah, so the plot of the story, there's these two women who have grown up together, and the story jumps back and forth between the present and the past. And in the present, one of them is an alcoholic and is struggling with that, and the friend is trying to support her. And we know pretty early on that there's something odd about the narrator, who's the friend, but we don't initially know exactly what's going on. But I loved the story. I thought it was I thought it was so great. I guess I don't know if there's anything else you want to say or could say about. Do you remember the moment I guess it was that thing, the noticing the AA initials.
Yeah.
It was sort of did it all kind of come sort of come to you at that point, or did you have to sort of build it over time?
I mean, I struggled to tell that story because the point of view was really tricky and the voice was really tricky. And I started that story. I mean, I have like 5 or 6 different versions of that story, and from one point of view, from the other point of view, from from first person, from third person. Of course, it ultimately wound up in second, which I also used for Gustella. That's kind of my nuclear option when a story isn't working any other way. I'm like, okay, let's try second voice, or second person. So, part of it was the initials, and then somewhat as with Ever After, there are other parallels, right? I mean, there's lost memory in both cases. Notably, lost time is a big issue for people with alcoholism, and is also something that alien abductees talk about. And then there's this, sort of semi-closed society of the other people who get it, right? Either your AA meeting or your alien abduction support group. So.
And then what kind of did you get a good response to that story, or did you hear from alien abductees or anything like that?
I didn't, that I'm aware of. I mean, a lot of people really liked it. Some people, because the narrator, I mean, as the story goes along, like, we think she has an eating disorder, right? And it turns out she doesn't. It turns out something very, very different is going on. But there were people who didn't get that and thought that I was, that I was being unkind or unfair to people with eating disorders. So, that was a little disappointing to me as a writer, but there were other people who did get it. So, and there was at least one reader who got it, but said, well, no, that can't be what she meant. So it must be dissing eating disorders, right? I'm like, but we have no control over what people make of our work. So, but a lot of people enjoyed it and thought it was clever and enjoyed the characters. So.
Yeah, well, I loved it, and I did not have that interpretation at all. So,
okay.
But so talk about putting together the second collection. Again, it's called All Worlds Are Real. So what was the process like of assembling that one?
So the process there, I've always been a very slow writer. Okay. And at this point, I'm a deliberately slow writer when I'm writing at all, because that way my ideas don't peter out on me. I mean, except for the few occasions when a story has come to me in a blinding flash, like Gustella, a lot of my stuff takes years and years and years and years, right? I mean, there are stories in All Worlds Are Real that date back to 1988, and the collection came out in 2019, and the stories had been published long after 1988. So, I had all these stories. I was feeling pretty despondent about my career, which, I dip in and out of thinking, I'll never sell anything again. I'll never write anything again. No one will ever read me, blah, 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 blah. Most writers go through this. But I've never been one of those people who can knock out a novel a year, right? And I was talking to a friend who's an artist who was dissing his own work and saying he wanted nothing to do with it. And he actually had a piece in a museum, and he had gone to the museum to get this piece back so he could destroy it because he didn't want anybody to look at it. And I was furious at him. I was so angry. And after a day or two, I realized that my anger at him was actually my anger at myself for being a wuss about trying to get my stuff out there, right? So then I'm like, okay, I've got to try to sell a second collection. My agent at the time was Kay McCauley, who very, very sadly has since died. and she had sort of gently said that she wasn't able to sell the thing because nobody was buying collections, and I've never been someone who makes a lot of money either. I had tried it at Tachyon, and they were like, no. But then Jacob said, well, let me introduce you to Patrick Swenson at Fairwood Press, because he does print on demand, which is a much more economically viable model for people who aren't New York Times bestsellers, right? And that turned into a go. And I had a wonderful time with Patrick putting the book together. And then, the book got nominated for a Philip K. Dick Award. So, that was pretty fabulous. So I'm really glad that it happened.
I mean, the way you tell it in the book is that Joe Walton kind of like marched you up to Patrick Swenson and like insisted that you pitch in.
Oh, Joe. Okay. Right. I had forgotten that part. Thank you for reminding me. No, Joe Walton, who sort of has specialized in giving me kicks in the rear when I need them, marched me up to Jacob because Jacob had the manuscript for a while at that point, and I mean a long time, and I was too scared to query about it. And she marched me up to him to ask what was going on, and I think that's when he introduced me to Patrick Swenson.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it seems like, Joe Walton has been a real big, she wrote the introduction for this book. It seems like she's been a big booster for your career.
Yes, I'm very grateful.
Except she says, why aren't you, every time she sees me, she demands, why aren't you more famous? Why don't your books sell better? She gets quite cross about it.
Yes, and my answer is always, I don't know. Like, if I knew that, I'd fix it, right? I mean, part of it is because I'm not a fast writer. A lot of my stuff is kind of uncomfortable to read. It's about pretty heavy subjects, right? It's not light, fluffy, fun stuff. I mean, not that it would have to be. I mean, plenty of people do not fluffy, fun stuff, and they're perfectly, successful and popular and famous and all of that. And I'm very bad at PR. I mean, I hate self-publicizing. I don't do it well. I try not to do it at all. I mean, I have this utopian belief that the work should be able to speak for itself. And that, in fact, if there's a good story out in the world, it shouldn't matter who wrote it, because what matters is the relationship between the reader and the text, which is a lovely idea, but doesn't work in the real world because you've got to get your stuff out there somehow, which means that, you need a certain amount of self-promotion. And people have suggested that I self-publish. I'm like, no, it would die on the vine. I would never be able to get enough copies out there.
Well, yeah. I mean, just, as I read and review a lot of books and interview a lot of authors, and there is not, I would say, much of a correlation between what I think is good and what is popular. I mean, like so many, especially if you're talking about short stories and short story collections. I mean, even the most amazing of them almost never gets any real traction in the marketplace.
Well, right, which is why publishers don't buy them, right? Because they don't sell. And that's when I was initially trying to market All Worlds Are Real, a few years before this conversation with my artist friend, everybody was like, short story collections don't sell, short story collections don't sell, short story collections don't sell. I mean, I had been publishing with Tor at that point. I had, 4 novels with Tor. But they weren't going to look at a story collection. Tachyon, which had done my first one, didn't want to do this one. I mean, presumably because the first one hadn't made enough money. I'm not sure it had made any money at that point. And then Patrick could afford to do it because he's print on demand, but I didn't get an advance. And my attitude towards that has always been, I would rather not get an advance and increase the chances of earning out. Because for my novels, I got advances, and the only one that earned out was Flying in Place, because it was a tiny advance, and that book did unexpectedly well. And the others were well reviewed and well received critically, but didn't make any money. So, after that, it's much harder for a publisher to want to touch you, because, it's a business. They have to keep their lights on. I get it.
Yeah, I mean, it really seems in most cases, if someone becomes a big bestseller or something, it really only happens because, like, they have one book that, just for whatever reason is spectacularly successful, and then that builds them enough of an audience that they can just have the freedom to write whatever they want after that. Or they just kind of write the same book over and over every year, and people who like that kind of book gradually find them and know that they're going to supply that experience.
I'm not sure that's always true. I mean, if you look at people like John Scalzi or Joe Walton, they do very well with a lot of different kinds of material, but they're writing a book a year. And not everybody can do that.
Yeah, that definitely helps for sure. I just love short stories so much, and I like sort of, offbeat short stories a lot. So I always wish that more people would read single author short story collections and read some of these things like Gastella and Ever After and Recoveries. I mean, you're really missing out, people, if you're not reading this stuff.
Thank you. Well, I think so, but I'm biased. So I'm glad you think so too. It's a frustration. But short stories seem to be a niche market. And to some extent, I understand that. I mean, I never used to be someone who read series. And lately, I have started reading series. It took me, after I left the university, it took me 2 years to be able to read for pleasure again, which was one of the reasons I left. And at that point, I kind of discovered the pleasures of comfort fiction. I mean, I was doing emotionally difficult work in healthcare environments. And I discovered the comfort of just picking up a book and then picking up the next book and picking up the next book, and knowing that the world of the characters were going to be the same. And especially during the pandemic, right, when, everything was at risk and everything was questionable and everything felt dangerous. The safety of that was a very powerful draw. And I don't think the world's getting any safer. So I think that's why people prefer novels and long series, because they can sink into that world and become part of that world and know that world's, continuing in the next book or the next 5 or 10 books. And they can stay there and don't have to completely readjust their perceptions and their understandings of things.
Well, that kind of reminds me of this sort of amazing story you told in this Tangent Online interview I mentioned, where as a kid you had this sort of cadre of imaginary friends. Uh-huh. Could you talk about about the math teacher and the guidance counselor?
Oh, yes, I love this story, and I know that a lot of my responses have gone over your 3-minute limit, and this one will too. So please bear with me. So when I was in 3rd grade, I was a very dreamy, weird, imaginative kid. I have since, when I was 61, I was actually diagnosed with mild Asperger's. But, back in the 1960s, nobody knew that, so they just thought I was weird. And I had a very, very involved imaginary world, which involved, the 3 main components were Star Trek Narnia and Elsa the Lioness from Born Free, who was mating with Aslan from Narnia and having lion cubs who were running around. And I also had some of my own characters. I mean, there were 3 princes who were fighting of control for a palace and flew around with little jetpacks attached to their heels. And so, this was all very complicated and there were stories and blah, blah, blah. And I hated math. Math scared me. Math still scares me. And I wasn't learning to multiply. And my math teacher would get frustrated with me and saying, you aren't paying attention. Go sit in the back of the room at the table with, basically it was the table with the kids who weren't performing up to par. So I'd go sit there. And then at some point she started saying she was getting really frustrated with me, and I was doing very well in all my other classes. And she got really frustrated with me and said, okay, I want you to go tell your teachers that you haven't been paying attention in math class. I want you to go tell your other teachers you haven't been paying attention in math class. And, I may have been a weird kid, but I wasn't stupid. I wasn't going to do that. So the classrooms were joined by bathrooms, which was kind of a weird setup, but I would hide in the bathroom until classes changed, and then I'd go on to my next class, right? So I'm flunking math. Nobody can figure out what to do. My parents, who were, for all their problems, were great advocates for me. And my mother at that point was a teacher, but nobody could figure out what was going on. There was actually talk of having me change schools. And then finally, somebody sent me to the guidance counselor. He was this very tall, skinny man who looked like David Frost, if you know who that is. He was looked kind of like a stork to me, and he was very kind. And he sat me down and said, and no one else had asked this question, not the math teacher, not my parents who loved me and were worried, right? He said, Susan, when you're not paying attention in math class, what are you doing? And I said, oh, I'm imagining. He said, what are you imagining? And I told him the story about, Elsa and Aslan and the Cubs and the three princes with their jetpacks and Spock and the crew of the Enterprise flying around. And he said, wow, that's really interesting. And he dug out this old manual typewriter from somewhere or other and perched on a stool and said, okay, so here's what we're going to do. You're going to tell me that story and I'm going to type it up, and then you're going to draw pictures to illustrate it. And I thought that sounded cool. So I told the story again and he typed it up. We had a page or two, and he gave it to me and I drew pictures. And then he smiled at me and said, now, I want you to take this to all of your teachers and tell them this is what you're doing when you're not paying attention in math class. And, and most of my teachers were like, well, yeah, duh. I mean, they knew I was smart and imaginative. And the math teacher started spending extra time with me after school. She brought me little presents. And my mother sat down with me with a bowl of M&Ms and flashcards and, got me to memorize my times tables. And I still can't look at an M&M without reciting the times table. So, it was a wonderful little story about somebody who was empathic and understood kids and was willing to listen. Many years later, in 1992, my mother had a stroke, a mild stroke, fortunately, and I was, I had gone to see her in the hospital, and a friend of hers was visiting, and this was someone she knew from when she had worked in the school system in our town, and this woman was a psychologist and named Leah, and somehow this story came up. I told Leah the story, and Leah said, Susan, where did you go to school? And I said, Quarles. And she said, oh, I know who that was. That was Tony Aruvalo. He's my friend. You should call him and tell him that story. He would love to hear that story. And I was like, oh, come on. It was years ago. He won't remember. Well, I wound up calling the guy, and he remembered who I was immediately. And he said, that math teacher was a total bitch. And I couldn't tell you that when you were in third grade. He said she had no business working with children, and he was delighted to learn that I had become a writer. I sent him a copy of Flying in Place, which had just come out, and it was a very happy story. But that's a story about the power of storytelling and about the power of people who are willing to work outside the box and ask, so what's really going on here?
Yeah, no, I just love that story. And it just makes you think whenever there's a kid who's not paying attention, definitely ask why and what they're thinking about instead, because you might have the next
Right.
Susan Palwick on your hands without even knowing it.
Right, or someone even better, I mean, a lot of the brightest people I know never finished high school because they were bored.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
I mean,
Um,
and the educational system hasn't gotten any better since I was in third grade. So,
yeah, that was sort of my experience a lot of the time as well.
mm-hmm.
But I did want to ask you before we run out of time. I mean, you mentioned that you became Episcopalian and worked as a lay preacher and stuff like that.
Uh-huh.
And there was a quote you have here. You say, "My definition of scripture with a small s is any story that helps create and maintain community. That includes all the
Right.
various holy scriptures, but it also certainly includes Buffy, Lord of the Rings, Star Trek, and so forth. Any beloved
Right.
story that imparts a sense of shared experience and values." So
Right.
I liked that.
Right. Exactly. And my famous story about that, which, if we have a few more minutes, this is another one that probably runs over three, but, and this story has gotten a tremendous response from students, especially, and I've actually used it when I've preached, and it gets, good reactions there too. So I was a Star Trek fan, as I said, and in middle school, I was in an easily integrated school where, according to the adults, the white kids were going to college and the black kids weren't, and most of the white kids were Jewish, and I was white and not Jewish. I wasn't anything at that point, and my best friend was black and smarter than anyone else in the school, and I was getting bullied like every day by everybody. I would have bullied me if I practically had a neon sign on my head saying bully me. I was a teacher's pet, and I wore weird clothes and I looked funny and all that. So and my friend Nadia was the person who stood up to the bullies and said, "Stop that, leave her alone." And they did, which I thought was a miracle. And it turned out she was a Star Trek fan too. So we talked about Star Trek on the phone for hours every night. And in 1973, we went to the second Star Trek convention in New York City because my father and stepmother lived there, and we could stay with them and take the bus down to the hotel. So it was perfect. And one of the people who spoke there was Nichelle Nichols, who, as you probably know, had been planning at one point to leave Star Trek because she was so bored with only saying, "All hailing frequencies open, Captain." And Martin Luther King Jr., who was a fan, this cannot have been long before he died, called her and said, "You have to stay on the show. Your people need role models." So she did. And she spoke at the convention, and she looked out over us. And if you've seen Galaxy Quest, it was just like that. Okay. I love that movie. It was the sea of pimples and fake Spock ears and all the rest of it, all these geeky adolescents. And she looked out over this crowd and said, "People make fun of you because you love Star Trek. They think Star Trek is only about bad acting and cheesy special effects. And you know that Star Trek is about more than that. You know that Star Trek is about love and peace and justice. And that's why it's your job to go out and save the world." Okay. And it was like being at a tent revival. I mean, we were all in tears. That was the year I decided to become a writer. My friend Nadia decided to become a NASA scientist, and, didn't quite do that, but got a master's in biomechanics and a PhD in physical anthropology, and wound up working for companies that manufacture artificial joints. Okay. And like writing some of the FDA stuff around that. So, had a big impact on a lot of people. So it was a pivotal moment. Many years later, I told this story as part of a conference paper on science fiction as conversion narrative. And one of the people in the audience, this was at the Popular Culture Association, and one of the people in the audience raised her hand after the talk and said, and it turned out she was the president of the PCA's science fiction and fantasy area, which was huge. And she said, I'm a little older than Susan was, but I was at that same Star Trek convention in 1973, and I heard that same talk by Nichelle Nichols, and here we both are. So I've always wanted to somehow send out email to everyone who was in that ballroom and say, how did that speech change your life? Because it did that for at least three of us.
Yeah, that's really amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great.
I guess maybe the last thing I'll ask you about is, so I was looking over some of your publications that you had on New York Review of Science Fiction, and The Last Unicorn showed up more than once.
Oh yeah,
and I'm a big Last Unicorn fan. I read the book as a kid, but I just got married in May, and my wife and I danced to. Oh, thank you. Danced to the song from The Last Unicorn for our first dance at our wedding. So, it's a definite favorite of mine. So, but I was just wondering if you could talk about kind of what was your Last Unicorn experience?
My Last Unicorn experience. So I read it when I was young, 10, 12, something like that, and really liked it, and reread it a bunch of times. And every time I reread it, I found more. It's one of those books that's kind of inexhaustible. I mean, The Lord of the Rings is like that too. I've now taught The Lord of the Rings a number of times, and every time you go back to it, there's more that you didn't see the first time. And the thing I loved about that book, even as a kid, and appreciated even more as an adult, was that the happy ending was very qualified. I mean, there was a happy ending, but there was also real loss and sacrifice. So, so in that sense, it was a very realistic story about a unicorn. And there was a tremendous amount of feeling in it, and just a lot of wisdom, and people struggling with feelings, and and people trying to make sense of who they are and how they fit into the world. I mean, that's true of the unicorn in both of her guises. It's true of Schmendrick. It's true of Molly Grew to some extent. So
when you wrote about it for Endursive, what kind of observations did you make, or what was the thrust of those?
And the Nearsive essay actually started out as a paper for a college class. I took this course called, what was it? It was a science and technology course that talked about science fiction, and the professor had a very, I had talked all my science fiction friends into taking the course, and he had a very different definition of technology than we did. I mean, his definition of technology started with the Industrial Revolution. And we kept saying, no. Fire is a technology, weaving is a technology, all of these things. And so we spent the first, 3 weeks of the course arguing about that. And so he didn't like us very much. And he assigned The Last Unicorn, and I wrote this paper about it, which basically the point is that the magic isn't a matter of transformation, it's a matter of recognition, right? You're saying a raven is like a writing desk, not to turn one into the other, but because you've already recognized that one is like the other. So you're making that visible to other people. And the professor, gave me a very good grade and said he had never read, a better paper about a mediocre book. And I I was like, oh, how dare you? You're dissing one of my favorite books. You don't get to do that. So, but then years later, I dug out the essay to when we were looking for material for Nearsive. I dusted it off and sort of handed it to David Hartwell and said, hey, would this do? And he's like, yeah. So they printed it for the first time. And yeah, that's a beautiful book, and I really love it.
Yeah, wow, I am just, it was like a stab through the heart hearing that right there. The professor's comment to you, like, wow, that is not cool, man.
No, it wasn't. It was always, and I also wanted to say, if you don't like this book, why did you assign it to us? You put it on the syllabus, okay? So, yeah. It was, there was a party in the department, and a bunch of us went, and his wife was there, and his wife told me, most of the time he complains about the fact that he can't get anybody to talk, and he said in that class all he has to do is walk into the room and say technology, and then hide under the desk while people throw things at each other. So it was an exciting experience for all of us.
Yeah. Wow. All right. So we're pretty much out of time. Do you have, what are you up to now? Do you have anything you're working on or projects you want to let people know about?
Oh, I always have things I'm working on. So I have 2 stories coming out in Best of the Year anthologies, which is exciting. My story Sparrows, which was in Asimov's, is being reprinted in Year's Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, and my story The Long View is being reprinted in Paula Garan's Year's Best Fantasy #2. And I have a story forthcoming in Lightspeed. And in terms of ongoing projects, I'm always working on stuff. I'm struggling with a fantasy trilogy right now, which I don't know if it will ever get done. But I'm pecking away at it, so we'll see.
You're on the first book of the trilogy, or?
I kind of have a draft of the whole thing. First, it was going to be 1 book, and then it was going to be 2, and then somebody read it and said, no, it needs to be 3. So and it's actually sort of like 3 novellas. The books are short. So I'm sort of halfway through the second in this iteration of it. I have a writing group, which is helpful because they can tell me if I'm still on track. So I've been showing it to them, but it's gonna take me a while to finish it, and I already, of course, have revisions to make based on their feedback. So
yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, and definitely a fantasy trilogy. If you want to become a big best-selling author, a fantasy trilogy is more likely to do that than a short story collection.
Well, I'm not sure this one would. It's pretty bleak. But we'll see. Stranger things have happened, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I don't know. That actually, a bleak fantasy trilogy composed of short books sounds almost like my ideal reading experience. So
cool.
I'm eager for it anyway.
Good, thank you. Good to know that there's someone out there who is.
All right, great. So any other final thoughts or anything?
Not that I can think of. Just thanks for talking to me. It's been fun, and and congratulations again on your marriage, and congrats on the long running Geek's Guide to the Galaxy, because this has been going for a while.
13 years. So yeah, quite a while.
Yeah, very impressive. Very impressive. So.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And it's been so great speaking to you, Susan. We've been, again, speaking with Susan Palwick about her books, The Fate of Mice and All Worlds Are Real. So thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Susan Palwick for joining us on the show. This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy was made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.